Today we're going to be looking at converting repeating decimals to fractions. But before we get started with that, let's look at just changing any decimal to a fraction. So it is pretty critical that you know your place value with your decimals before you can turn them into fractions. So this 4 is in the tenths place, this 5 is in the hundredths place. So I would write this as 45 over 100. 45 over 100 would simplify. Common factor would be 5. So if I divide them both by 5, I would have 9 over 20 for 45 hundredths as a decimal becomes 9/20ths as a fraction. Let's skip on down to this one. This 3 is in the tenths place value, so I take the 3, write it over 10. 3/10 as a decimal, as a fraction. It will not simplify. It is what it is. This 5 is in the hundredths place value, so I'm going to write 95 over 100. It will also simplify by a factor of 5, and that will become 19 over 20 is equivalent to 95 hundredths as a decimal. This one, 8 is in the tenths place value, so 8 over 10. It will simplify by a factor of 2, and that is 4 over 5. 4/5 is equal to 8/10 as a decimal. Here we have 3 numbers after the decimal, so that 5 is in the thousandths place value. So we're going to begin with writing 125 over 1000. And that will simplify, and the common factor here is huge. It's 125. So when we simplify this, it simplifies to 1/8. We've got another one here. This is 4/10. It will simplify to 2/5. The common factor is 2. Here, this is one I'm hoping that you guys have memorized. It may start off as 25 over 100, but I hope you've seen this one enough to know that it simplifies to 1/4. It's a funny looking arrow. Here, the 5 is in the thousandths place value, so we begin with 75 over 1000. And the factor that we can take out, again, is 125. So I divide both the numerator and denominator by 125, and I'm left with 7/8. And that's all we have for just plain old terminating decimals. So now let's get into the nitty-gritty with what do we do when we have a repeating decimal. So the lovely thing about this, if it were just the terminating decimal 23 hundredths, I would write it as this. But this one's a little bit more complicated because both the 2 and the 3 are repeating. So for that reason, this is how I deal with it. I put a 23 over a 99. I take 1 away from that 100 denominator. And if you take you take a calculator and you divide 23 by 99 on your display, it will give you this. For as much as it can display. Okay, not too terrible, right? So 0.7, if it were a terminating decimal, we'd write it as 7/10. But because it's a repeating decimal, we'll take 1 away from here, and this will be 7, gracious, 7/9. And if you divide 7 by 9 on your calculator, you will get 0.77777777. So 7/10 repeating, or 0.7 repeating as a decimal, will be 7/9 as a fraction. So then let's look at this one. This 6 is in the thousands place value. So if it were a terminating decimal, if there was no bar over the top of all of these, we would write it as 126/1000. That's how we would write that. And then we would simplify it. Well, because the 1 and the 2 and the 6 all repeat, I'm going to write it as 126/1000 minus the 1 would be 999. And then from there, does that simplify? Do they have a common factor? They do. It will simplify to 14/111. So the common factor that we took out, what was it? How'd we get from 126 to 14 and 999 to 111? We divided both of those by 9. What do you do when you have a 0 and another number repeating? How do we deal with that? Is that any different? So if it were the terminating decimal, 0.08, come on, Ben. There we go. We would write it as 8/100, and we'd simplify that. But that's not going to work for this one because both the 0 and the 8 are repeating. So let's take 1 away from our denominator. So 0.08, both the 0 and the 8 repeating, will be 8/99. So if you take your calculator and you take 8 and divide it by 99, will it give you 0.08 repeating? Yes, it will. Okay, so let's start with some of the easier ones. We're going to skip that one right there. We've got a 0.1 repeating. What place value is it in? What would it be as a fraction if it were a terminating decimal? If it was just 0.1, what would that fraction be? 1/10, correct. But this one is repeating, so what is 0.1 repeating as a fraction? 1/9, very good. This is one you might have memorized. 0.3, the terminating decimal would be 3/10. But this is a repeating decimal of 0.3. what would that be as a fraction? Three ninths. Or if you have this one memorized, you know that it will simplify to 1/3. All right, this next one's a little more complicated, so we're going to skip that one for right now, and let's go to this one. As a terminating decimal, 0.4, 4/10. But we have a repeating decimal, so as a fraction, that repeating 4 is 4 ninths. All right, now I've skipped a couple of these because that's a really big number, right? And how many of us are super comfortable with our decimal place value to that point? So let's look at this. It can be done. This is the tenths place. This is hundredths, thousandths, 10,000ths, 100,000ths, and millionths. So if it was not repeating, if it was a terminating decimal, tenths, hundredths, thousandths, 10,000ths, 100,000ths, millionths. So we would put all of that with 1 million as our denominator. But because this repeats, because we have this bar up here that indicates that it repeats, we're going to take 1 away from this denominator. And we will have 999,999. One less than 1 million. So it's not that bad. It's doable. Okay, both the 9 and the 0 are repeating on this one. So instead of 0.90, which would be 90 over 100, take 1 away from the denominator because both of these are repeating. So that'd be 90 over 99. This one will simplify. Common factor. I'm hoping it's glaring. It is a 9. So in simplest form, lowest terms, this fraction reduces to 10 over 11. Okay. 0.54, both are repeating. So the terminating decimal would have been 54 over 100. Why did I do that? Okay, 0.54 is equal to 54 over 100. Take 1 away from the denominator. So 0.54, both repeating, is 54 over 99. That will also simplify. 9 is still the common factor, and that will be 6 over 11. Alright, I think this is the last one that is like this. Both are repeating, so 0.63. If it were not repeating, that terminating decimal would be written as 63 over 100. Okay, that's not what we have. Okay, so 63 both repeat would be 63 over 99. There is a common factor, so it will simplify. It is 9 again. That will be 7, and that will be 11. What would this one be? 1800ths, but it's a repeating 1800ths. What would that be as a fraction? Will it simplify? What's the common factor? And what is your final fraction? Well done. Okay, now we got to deal with these boogers. And they are a little more complicated. Notice here, my 8 is not repeating. And that makes it a lot more complicated. So we're going to decompose this guy. We're going to make this into the terminating decimal of 0.8, and then the repeating decimal of 0.03. This is just the way that it's easiest for me to understand. So, right here, this one's easier enough. We've done that. I feel like we've done that already. It does start off as 8/10, and that simplifies to 4/5. Okay, so what I've done here is I've just taken the place values of each of these individually and broken them apart. So 0.8 plus the 0.03 repeating 3 together would be this total right here. So now I'm going to deal with this 0.03 repeating. Now, this 0 is not repeating. So instead of taking 1 away, I'm actually going to take 10 away from that place value. So it would have been 3 over 100 if it was 0.3 repeating 3, repeating 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3. But we've got this 0 in here, and the 0 is not repeating. For that reason, I take a 10 away from that denominator. That gives me 3 over 90 is equivalent to 0.03 repeating 3. Go ahead and check that on your calculator and make sure that works for you. Does that give you 0.03 repeating 3? It does. Now, in the way that these two added together makes this 4/5 plus that 3/90 together will also give us equivalent to that. Okay, so we're going to take 4/5. See what I mean? This is a little more complicated. And this 3/90, and my pen's going to work. There we go. We're going to add those together. So 4/5 plus 3/90 is 5/6. Final answer. And if you take 5 and divide it by 6, does it give you 0.8 repeating 3? Yes, it does. All right, and I think we have another one like that. Yep, there it is. So this is the last one we're going to do, and it's like the one we just did. Yay! We're going to break this apart into two different decimals, one a terminating and one a repeating. So the terminating part is decimal 1, 1/10. There's that fraction. And then the repeating part of the decimal is 0.06, and the 6 is repeating. So if I add 1/10 and the 0.06 repeating together, I have this total. Okay? So I've got to take this ugliness of the 6 repeating and the 0 not. So the 6 goes on top, it's the numerator. The 6 is in the hundredths place value. The 0 is not repeating, so instead of taking 1 away, I'm taking 10 away. So that will be 6 over 90. And this one's easier to show you the math. If I convert this into 90s, 1/10 is equal to 9 90s. I can add 9 and 6 and get 15 over 90. They do have a common factor there. And it's probably bigger than what you're thinking. Common factor here is actually 15. 15 divided by 15 is 1. 90 divided by 15 is 6. That's a 6. So take your calculator and do 1 divided by 6. Push enter. Did you get 0.16 repeating 6? Well done. And that, my friends, is how you take repeating decimals and turn them into fractions. Thanks for listening.